Thank you all so much for joining us today. My name is Tori Bosch, and I am the editor of Future Tense. Future Tense is a partnership of New America, Arizona State University, and Slate Magazine, and our goal is to explore emerging technologies and their implications for public policy and for society. We do that daily on Slate, where we publish reporting and commentary at slate.com/futuretense, but we also like to get people together in real life, as they say. So a quick plug for another event we have coming up. On November 20th, we're going to be screening the 1975 cult classic Rollerball. Following the screening, we'll have a discussion about corporate power and questionable 70s fashion, hosted by ASU English professor Devone Lucer, who is a Jane Austen scholar who does roller derby under the name Stone Cold Jane Austen. Today, though, we're here to discuss something that I suspect doesn't have quite as questionable fashion involved in any way. Andy Greenberg's fascinating new book, Sandworm, A New Era of Cyberwar and the Hunt for the Kremlin's Most Dangerous Hackers. It looks at the most devastating cyber attack in history, and you can also read an excerpt of it on Slate, where we talked about where Andy wrote about the implications of NotPetya for hospitals in the US. Our speakers, who I'll introduce in a minute, will talk for about an hour, followed by 15 minutes of Q&A. When we get to the Q&A, please make sure to wait for the microphone. I know you may speak loudly, but this is being broadcast online, so please wait for the mic. We also ask that you identify yourself and make your question actually a question. After the Q&A, Andy will sign books, which are also for sale at the table outside, so please make sure you get a copy. And while we're on housekeeping notes, please make sure your phone's on silent. So now for the fun part. With us here today in the center is Andy Greenberg, author of the book Sandworm, A New Era for Cyberwar and the Hunt for the Kremlin's Most Dangerous Hackers. And I always have to look to see what the subhead is. I cannot. It's a little long, but very evocative. Sandworm was just released yesterday. He's also a senior writer for Wired, where he covers security, privacy, information freedom, and hacker culture. His reporting on Ukraine's cyber war has won the Gerald Loeb Award for International Reporting and 2 Deadline Club Awards from the New York Society of Professional Journalists. Then we have Peter Singer, who's a strategist and senior fellow here at New America. He's been named by the Smithsonian as one of the nation's top 100 leading innovators. Defense News calls him one of the 100 most influential people in defense issues, and Foreign Policy included him on their top 100 global thinkers list. His latest book is Like War, which explores how social media has changed war and politics and how war and politics have changed social media. And finally, our moderator will be Lily Hay Newman, who's a senior writer for Wired, where she writes about information security, digital privacy, and hacking. She also was previously the staff writer for Future Tense at Slate and my former colleague. So thank you all for being here. Off you go.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming today. Yeah, as Tori said, Sandworm just came out yesterday, so you probably haven't had a chance to read it yet, but I hope that you get a copy and you do soon. It kind of ties into a lot of things that may be occupying your mind right now. We just had an election yesterday, and there's a lot of sort of psychic space, I feel, taken up by these questions of influence operations, the ways that we may be exposed in our digital lives, and Sandworm really engages with those topics, as well as questions of destructive hacking and the big question of cyber war. What is cyber war? What is coming next? So I thought, since most of you won't have been able to read the book yet, that we would start by talking a little bit about Sandworm and what is Sandworm, or who is Sandworm, and then we'll dig deeper into some of those huge topics that are, as I said, I think are occupying all of our minds right now. But the question of who is Sandworm, or what is Sandworm, is so fascinating, and the book just walks through this really amazing sort of mystery adventure of trying to find some answers to that, and just brings in history and so many concepts along the way. So Andy, the first thing I want to do is talk a little bit about how you got onto this story, and you can spoil the whole book and tell us who Sandworm is now, so we can all eat lunch.
Well, around the time that you started at Wired, actually, in late 2016, the editors, our editors, asked me to find the big story of Cyberwar. They actually wanted to do like a takeover of the whole issue, and I think that that was, you know, as is the case now, on the top of their mind was the election hacking, and there had just been the breaches of the Democratic National Committee and the Clinton campaign by Russian hackers, and this fervor that had just built in the months since then. So by late 2016, you know, we were ready to do some big piece about this, but I didn't see that as cyber war. I didn't actually know if I believed that cyber war was a real phenomenon that had actually taken place at that point. You know, the hacks that affected those election targets were more like digital dirty politics as I saw it. And so I went looking to please my editors for a real cyber war story. And I found it in Ukraine, where in 2014 there had been a pro-Western revolution that had been promptly followed by an invasion from Russia. And that invasion was accompanied, that physical invasion into the east of Ukraine and seizing the Crimean Peninsula, had been accompanied by wave after wave of cyber attacks that had hit every part of Ukrainian society, the media, the private industry, the government, and ultimately in this kind of really important red line crossing moment, the first ever attack on an electric utility that caused a blackout. These Russian hackers, as I read about this, had turned out the power to 250,000 Ukrainians, the first ever kind of hacker-caused blackout. And the mechanics of that were so cinematic when I looked into it. These hackers had not only you know, planted their malware on the IT systems, then gained access to the operational controls of the electric utilities in Western Ukraine that they were targeting, but they had hijacked the kind of IT staff's desktop control system. So they kind of gained, just as your like IT staff remotes into your PC and takes over your mouse, they took over the mouse controls of these grid operators, and these people in the control room of this Western Ukrainian electric utility had to watch helplessly as their own mouse clicked through circuit breakers, turning out the power with each click to thousands of Ukrainians. So I was immediately drawn to this story, like who are these almost Hollywood-style evil hackers? And I followed the traces of that hacker group back to their initial discovery in 2014. This little company outside of DC called Eyesight Partners had found that that these hackers, who appeared to be Russian because they actually traced the group's infections to a server, a command and control server that left open a directory that included a how-to manual for their malware written in Russian. So they were clearly Russian-speaking hackers, and they seemed to have pretty Russian typical targets like Eastern European and NATO political espionage targets. But then it became clear that they were also breaching American grid operators. And these hackers who had actually hacked the American grid, for each of their victims, they had planted a piece of malware. And in that malware, they had a little campaign code that they used to identify the victim. And each one was a reference to the sci-fi novel Dune. And so Eyesight Partners named this group Sandworm. And when I heard this story, I mean, first of all, it's a cool name. And to me, it evokes this kind of like, if you've read Dune, this kind of giant monster that lies beneath the surface and occasionally surfaces to do terrible, destructive things. I mean, it turned out to be kind of a perfect name for this group. But also, it was for me, this moment where I was like, wait, the same hackers that crossed the line for the first time in Ukraine and turned out the power to civilians had also planted their malware in the American grid. This is not just a story about Ukraine. This is a story with immediate analogous importance for American national security. And as I was looking into all of this, Sandworm did it again and caused a second blackout, this time in the Ukrainian capital of Kiev. So I could see that I was not too late to this story. It was still unfolding, this cyber war. And I believed now that it was actually the first true cyber war. It was still unfolding in front of me. And I wrote this first big magazine piece for Wired about this premise that we could look to Ukraine to see what Russia's kind of most aggressive cyber war capabilities were, that Russia was using Ukraine as a testing ground, as a test lab for cyber war, and that what happened to Ukraine needed to be recognized because it would soon happen to the rest of us. Or these were capabilities that could easily spill out from Ukraine to affect all of us. And kind of bizarrely, the day that Wired cover story hit newsstands, predicting that what happened to Ukraine would soon happen to the rest of us, a piece of malware called NotPetya hits Ukraine and immediately spread to the rest of us and became the worst cyber attack in history, and ultimately cost $10 billion, which far exceeds anything we'd ever seen before. And
I like that Andy often says you don't want your prediction to come true that day.
yeah, yeah. I don't think anybody actually noticed that we made this prediction because it actually came true within like 24 hours. So, but NotPetya was, I was soon able to trace it back to Sandworm again, and then I could see that there was a much bigger story here, a story about how we watched the cyber war unfold in Ukraine, how certain kind of detectives had followed these attacks and tried to warn the world that we need to pay attention to what's happening here, and it will soon hit us too. And those warnings were ignored until it was too late, and it ballooned out into this kind of cataclysmic and very tragic, ultimately, cyber attack that hit the whole world. So those are the kind of first two acts, ultimately, of the book, this kind of detective story that becomes a disaster story.
Yeah, yeah, and I think the nice thing about the book is that you get all these fascinating. I mean, Sandworm as a group is just incredibly fascinating, and trying to imagine, who is behind the ghost mouse, hundreds of miles away or whatever it is really amazing. But the specifics of Sandworm kind of tie in to this larger point that Sandworm is one of the groups that took some really significant first steps, or early crossing the Rubicon type steps in destructive cyber war. And one thing I think is interesting is that the idea that this type of destructive hacking is possible has been around for almost decades. People have really been discussing the idea that it could be technologically feasible to cause blackouts, or what's the paper of the flying toaster, or the problems with the Internet of Things devices, eyes everywhere. All these types of ideas have been around for a long time, that it very well could be technologically possible, or even was, but it sort of never happened for a really long time. So, Peter, one thing I am sort of fascinated to hear about is that your book, Cybersecurity and Cyber War from 2014, was in that transition era, and you would have been reporting it in this transitional time where there had been some indications, and I'm specifically talking about Stuxnet, but we don't sort of need to go into a whole side thing about that, but there had been some indications in the early 2010s that things were finally getting closer, that more might actually happen. But this whole huge history that Andy just sort of summarized had not yet occurred. So what was it like reporting on this issue at that time, and sort of how is that the lens that you view what's happened since the book?
Sure. So I want to begin, though, by congratulating Andy on this book. As a reviewer put about it, it's informative and entertaining as hell.
The reviewer being Peter.
It's well worth it. That's me. I got a chance to read an early version of it, and very much mean that. And it's a great book, and by combining sort of the best of reporting, but also storytelling, and that's what's great about it. So to hit your question, I was thinking about it. There's in essence sort of there's many, but I point out three things that have changed in that time since we were doing the book Cybersecurity and Cyber War that have become significant. One is you put your finger on it, is this shift in, and you could frame it lots of different ways, but I think of it as the complete and utter collapse of cyber deterrence. That for the first generation plus of us caring about cybersecurity, our response was this idea that we could build up global norms that would steer people away from making attacks on scale or attacking certain kind of targets. That surely we could all agree that certain types of targets would be off limits. And that discourse was playing out everywhere from in academia to there was various legal conferences on it, to it was part of it was the core of U.S. strategy, to it was, of course, playing out at the United Nations, a global group of experts and the like. And then we had these series of attacks that were basically someone crossed that line and really nothing happened in response to them crossing that line. And then since then, we've seen a complete kind of utter lack of fear and temerity from not just this set of attackers, but the wider set of attackers. And Andy captures this in the book, but we also see it in the news every day. It's hitting everything from Ukrainian power grids to Olympics to American power banks, governmental systems, probes on election systems, you name it. And every other actor is looking at this and saying, I can get away with this and do it too. And it's also leading to changes in behavior. In the book, they're trying to cover their tracks in a way that some of these actors are no longer putting the hard work into covering their tracks because, well, they know it doesn't matter if they get caught. There's, for example, the data on breakout speed within entities getting in a network. So one is sort of the collapse of cyber deterrence. The second, related, and you could get a taste of this, is the scale and impact of the attacks is definitely going through a shift. And when you think about, like when we were doing the book back in 2012, there was one mega breach in the entire year. Mega breach, 10 million plus people touched by the impact of the attack. One in the entire year.
What was it?
I'd have to go back and look at it. But now you guys are reporting on a mega breach literally once a week, or you're no longer reporting on them because they're so commonplace. And that has huge impact on how we think about our interaction with the internet, how we think about what we're allowed to do and not to do. But then you have the other, which is the physical impact of it, because the internet's changing into the IoT, to the Internet of Things. And so you can now start to affect things like, I'm not just stealing people's personal information, I can affect the power grid, or I can, we were talking about this in the room back there, it might not be doing ransomware to hold files hostage. It might be ransomware that shuts down the operations of systems, be it at a hospital, be it at a city transportation network. And then the third big change that we really hadn't seen back then, but now is becoming more common, is hybridization of the attackers and the attacks. So you are seeing these sets of, are they Russian criminals, but they're also conducting political style attacks or swinging back and forth, or in turn, you see North Korean state hackers targeting political, but also robbing a bank. And that's very difficult to face. And then we have the other hybridization that's playing out, which is I'm breaching a network, but I'm also trying to conduct activity in social media, and how these go back and forth. And of course, that hadn't taken off back then, and is something that we see now.
Yeah, and in terms of the covering your tracks thing, it kind of makes me think that one thing that has come up is the sort of plausible deniability that exists, or sort of lack of a standard that groups come forward after committing destructive attacks or aggressive hacking. And it sort of feels like there's this lawlessness that makes me think a lot about the NotPetya attack. You can do something very specific, like an attack on an electric grid or something that causes a blackout, or you can do something that has sort of one intention, but without a lot of concern for collateral damage or what else may happen, because it's like, well, who even did this? You know, it wasn't us. Like, there's no sort of face of these types of attacks. So, Andy, can you talk a little bit about how that played out with NotPetya and sort of that's the sort of scattered nature of it, that it isn't always just this one-to-one?
Yeah. Well, so the day that NotPetya hit, June 27th, 2017, I fell for this as well. It looked like ransomware, which, you know, as you guys know, it encrypts your computer and you have to pay a ransom to unlock it. Thousands and thousands of computers around the world were showing this ransom message. This was a ransomware worm, it looked like, that automatically spread from machine to machine. We quickly could see that it actually used, in part, a stolen NSA hacking tool to kind of hypercharge this spread, as well as like a password sealing tool. And the kind of secret ingredient was that the hackers, Sandworm, had hijacked this piece of Ukrainian accounting software so that everyone in Ukraine, because this was an ultra-common piece of software, kind of like the Quicken or TurboTax of Ukraine, everyone who had even filed taxes in Ukraine had this software on their network, and so the hackers hijacked the updates of that software to push out their worm, to seed it out to thousands of networks. But it looked at first like it was a for-profit attack, that they were just trying to get ransoms. But we quickly, when I spoke to Ukrainians, who are always the first to say, actually, this was Russia and did cyberwar, they were right that you could not actually, when you paid the ransom, you still couldn't decrypt your files. That was just a very thin cover story over this ultimately destructive attack. But it worked for about 24 hours, and then we could see that this was actually just another kind of even bigger act of disruption in the ongoing cyber war, and one that had spilled out from Ukraine to everyone who did business in Ukraine even. Because if Maersk, for instance, the world's largest shipping firm, had, I ultimately figured out, one computer in one office in Odessa in the south of Ukraine. And on that computer, they had installed this Ukrainian accounting software. And that was enough for their entire global network to be destroyed, essentially, by this worm. And that happened to Maersk and Merck and FedEx and Mondelez, the company that owns Nabisco and Cadbury, and Benkisler, this manufacturer of Durex condoms, and ultimately hospitals all across the US, and of course, the entire nation of Ukraine. I mean, 300 companies, I heard one estimate, were hit in Ukraine, and all of their computers just destroyed. So this is a scale of attack we'd never seen before. And for each of these multinational companies, they started to report to their shareholders hundreds of millions of dollars of damages. And you look at like a typical ransomware attack that hits on the front page of the New York Times, and it's like, they took down the city government of Atlanta. That will cost between like $10 and $20 million to fix. And each one of these companies were reporting like well over 10 times that sum, and in total $10 billion. I mean, this is not just the biggest attack in history. It's like an order of magnitude, several orders of magnitude bigger than the typical ransomware attack that we see. So I was at this point obsessed with the story of NotPetya, but I was also going crazy because, as Lily was getting at, there was this kind of initial confusion over who had done this had been pretty effective. All of these multinational companies like Maersk and Merck and FedEx were weirdly not saying this was Russia, this was part of the Ukrainian cyber war. They were not talking about how they had lost hundreds of millions of dollars to this kind of 1 in a million attack. They were just reporting to their shareholders that they'd lost this money and not telling any details. So for me, that became a months-long reporting process of trying to find any one of these companies whose anonymous sources, brave sources who would go against the wishes of their PR teams and share the experience of being hit with this kind of cataclysmic, data disaster.
Yeah, and will you just talk a little bit more about the people who were willing eventually to speak to you and how they felt? How does it feel to be standing in the room?
So ultimately, well, first, I should say that this is something I really love about Ukrainians, that they will just tell you everything about the experience of being hit with a cyber attack because they're so tired of being ignored, of being abused by Russia for, well, centuries really, but most recently, digitally, hit with one attack after another. So when I went to Ukraine, within a week, I had assembled an entire kind of oral history of the experience of NotPetya in Ukraine. Everyone had their own personal disaster story to tell me of how they, were working at the Ministry of Health, for instance, and they had to kind of make the split-second decision to take down the entire network so that it would not be hit by NotPetya and have all of these medical records destroyed. But then they left and tried to go home on the metro, but they couldn't get onto the metro because the payment system was down for the metro. So they went to go find cash to buy like a physical token, and all the ATMs were down in the neighborhood. And they finally found one ATM with like a tiny cash limit and they wait in line forever. They get some cash, and then they get on the metro, they go home, and they try to buy groceries, and the credit card system in the grocery store is down. And this kind of, as it was described to me by the person who told me that story, this was all one guy's story, and I heard dozens of these over a week. It felt like, as he put it, that it was this kind of disorientation, like he had lost a limb of his body, like everything just seemed to be broken. He couldn't live his life the way that he was used to. So there was a kind of, and he also described it as a kind of end of the world movie scenario. But then so as I was getting all this from Ukrainians, I did finally begin to piece together from anonymous sources the experience of one company, Maersk, who were brave enough to tell me how they had experienced NotPetya, which for them began, as one person described it, in seeing every computer in their global headquarters in Copenhagen just go black. And one IT administrator described to me looking up and seeing a wave of screens just go black, 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 black across the room. And then within minutes, people were running down hallways screaming to turn off every computer they could to spare them from this worm that was spreading. They were jumping over the turnstiles between parts of the building because even the physical security systems were broken, unplugging machines in the middle of meetings. But of course, it wasn't enough, and NotPetya spread to their entire global network. And for Maersk, that's not just a bunch of computers. That includes they own 76 terminals in ports around the world. And 17 of those terminals were entirely crippled by NotPetya. So you can imagine, this means that cargo ships the size of the Empire State Building are arriving at these terminals with another Empire State Building's worth of containers on top of them. And suddenly nobody knows what is on this ship. They have no idea how to unload it. And then simultaneously, thousands of trucks are arriving at these terminals, and the gate outside the terminal is dead. The voice over IP system that they use to tell the trucks where to go to pick things up and drop them off is totally offline. So I was able to reconstruct this best at the Newark terminal for Maersk in New Jersey, and there, I talked to a port staffer who watched trucks just line up miles long, with no idea what was even going on. Maersk couldn't even send them an email to explain what was happening. And then they're ultimately told, you got to find somewhere else to ship your cargo today, which means that some of them have just-in-time supply chain things for manufacturing processes or perishable goods. You have to figure out where to put these avocados, a truck full of avocados, where they can be refrigerated or they're going to rot. And this was happening not just in Newark, but in 17 of Maersk's terminals across the world. And then, of course, it's not just Maersk. It's also the same thing at actually even greater scale. Maersk lost $300 million to this. FedEx lost $400 million. Merck lost $870 million. They had to borrow some of their own HPV vaccine from the Center for Disease Control because their actual manufacturing of these important life-saving drugs was disrupted. And then even those dollar numbers, which are kind of the best quantitative measure we have of this don't capture the fact that this also spread to hospitals across the United States. I'm sorry, I'm maybe getting carried away, but
I'm deep in this with you because I think that exactly encapsulates the experience of reading Sandworm. The book just really conveys both sort of a lot of details and information about Sandworm and about these situations, but also just the emotional feelings and emotional destabilization that's such an important part of this. And there's one really memorable moment that's about the blackouts, but it's where one of the sort of central characters talks about, character/real person who exists and experienced this, talks about feeling that the Sandworm hackers kind of reached into their own home by turning off the lights, and stopping. His family was watching a movie, and suddenly it's just so personal when these things happen. Whether it's in your business life or not, the idea that someone from so far away could destabilize your entire life like this. So, and I think another personal element that is tied into the Sandworm story is the way in which destructive hacking and influence operations and sort of this exertion of power ultimately seem to go hand in hand. And I think a lot of the influence, disinformation stuff is a component that we all are sort of grappling with in our lives and hearing a lot about, certainly, but also maybe dealing with ourselves or seeing. And so, Peter, I'm curious about disinformation on social media, your book, Like War, and what is like war, and how do some of those concepts tie into what we're talking about?
So I want to pause and actually hit something that Andy said that connects back to the earlier point, but it'll circle around to get to your question.
We're on the journey with you.
So one of the things that I think stands out about these episodes, and Andy captures well the scale of the impact of it. Numeric $10 billion in damage, but also you can play it out in these incidents of hitting harbors shutting down, people being stuck places, et cetera, is that think of the equivalent of this in non-cyber terms. In effect, what would happen if the Russian government, sent a team that set a fire with matches that was designed to hit one target, but it burned out of control. And it cost $10 billion worth of damage around the world. This raging fire burned, and it hit harbors and shipping facilities were burning down, to the bank that you were getting your ATM from, to a drug company's processing facilities were damaged by this fire. How would we react versus the lack of response, the lack of consequence to what happened ex post NotPetya? Someone cost the world $10 billion worth of damage, had physical impact, and in effect, there was no real response to it and no real kind of punishment for it. And that goes back to the earlier question that you asked about, one of the biggest changes is for this long period of time, we tried to spread the message that if you do bad things, if you cross a line, there's going to be a certain kind of consequence for you. And this is where it's on both the Obama administration, but now the Trump administration, is part of why we've seen the collapse of cyber deterrence. And this connects to the story, to your question of disinformation, to what's playing out in elections today. Not just Russia continuing to hammer away in all sorts of different activities, but also, we've seen networks pushed by China, networks pushed by Iran. We've seen for-profit actors, just like we saw in cybersecurity, that try and break into a network. We're seeing the disinformation side of it is, in effect, the lack of response. And so in many ways, and Andy and I have talked about this, Ukraine was, it was like a test lab, but if you think about it as a historic parallel, it's like the Spanish Civil War before World War II, where the Germans were not only figuring out what tactics work best, blitzkrieg,
dive bombing. They were also figuring out what the world will let us get away with. So if you're an art person, Guernica, it's you can dive bomb a city and burn it down, and guess what? The world's not going to respond to you. And that's in effect part of the story of NotPetya, is that they didn't just do it, they got away with it, and we're still feeling the consequences of this today. And of course, we're feeling that in what I call the like war space. So if you think of cyberwar as the hacking of networks, like war is the hacking of people on the networks by driving ideas viral. And that's why we're still feeling this today. That's connection points, is that basically the attackers are not only feeling that they can do this, they're feeling that it's relatively low cost for them to pull it off and great consequence because they're not going to face any kind of negative aspect for it.
Yeah, I think that I agree, but I think that like for me the Guernica moment, and you gave me that analogy, and I failed to use it in the book, and I'm still kicking myself about it.
So I'm going to use it every time.
Yeah. The Guernica moment for me was what happened to Ukraine pre-NotPetya. We could see Russia doing all of these things, and the story of the book is Ukraine and a lot of Americans who were kind of the detectives following what was happening to Ukraine, trying to warn the U.S. government, you need to say something about this. At least put out a statement that just says, hey, it appears that Russia turned out the power to civilians with a cyber attack for the first time, and that's not okay. Like that's a red line we've tried to set for years, and someone has crossed it, and that we're going to globally recognize that red line has been crossed. At least just say that it's unacceptable in a public statement, and we heard nothing. Even as the Obama administration called out the North Korean attacks on Sony and Iranian attackers hacking U.S. banks, they treated this thing that was happening in Ukraine as this faraway foreign problem, and allowed, basically sent a message to Sandworm and its bosses that you can do this with impunity. And NotPetya was the result of that. This thing that we treated as this faraway foreign conflict came home for us very, very quickly. There was 8 months after NotPetya, finally a statement from the White House, maybe the shortest statement I've ever seen from a government body, that just said, NotPetya was the work of the Russian military, and it was the worst cyber attack in history, and there will be consequences for this. And that was kind of like, after years, that was the moment when I said, okay, finally, I'm not insane. Like the U.S. government has recognized that this is as bad as it looks. And a month later, there were sanctions as well for NotPetya. But it was just, it came so late.
The scale compared to...
Right, too little, too late by years. And in fact, as I tell in the book, even 6 days before that statement finally calling out these Russian hackers, there had been another disruptive attack by this same agency on the 2018 Olympics, which is a kind of third, maybe the biggest piece of action in the third act of the book. But we can get to that.
Well, it seems to me, and you guys tell me what you think, when I think about this sort of lack of response, the only thing I can imagine is that the global community doesn't really want to draw the lines, and that everyone is sort of tempted by the idea that they might want to reserve the ability to do these things themselves.
Well, I've certainly been trying to figure out, like, Peter may be more cynical than me, and it sounds like you believe that we've missed our chance to create a Geneva Convention for the internet, or some people describe it, Josh Corman calls it like a cyber no-fly zone, where we make rules that say, listen, you can do what you want with your fun cyber war activities, but if you touch a hospital, then that's a war crime, and you're going to be in The Hague. And I still want to hope that those kinds of norms can be set. It doesn't seem like any government is as enthusiastic about it as I am, though. And that's in part, it seems like, because from what I can tell, they're just too attracted to the power of these capabilities.
Yeah.
I think that's been one of the other shifts, say over the last 3+ years, is that
initially that norm building, trying to build whatever the laws and the no-goes are, was primarily a state-centric discussion. It was that the governments of the world would be the ones to build this. Again, you had this activity going on at the UN with the global group of experts. You had it at discussions within NATO. And it's basically sort of, it collapsed, it fell by the wayside. Now, you use that phrase, Cyber Geneva Conventions, like, it's the private sector that's stepping into, and that's another big change, or whether you think about Tech Accord, it's basically companies starting to say, okay, governments, if you're not going to set it, we're going to try and set these norms. But the key with a norm for it to lock into affect behavior is that it either has to have rewards or negative consequences. And that's what we've really not done a good job of. For the most part, the attackers are still seeing this as low cost, high gain. Whether the attack is, think about all the articles and speeches and Hollywood movies that were made about the nightmare scenario of what if someone took down a power grid and then they did it and ... okay? Or, what if someone tried to affect an election? ... And so that the message, and again, the financial costs of putting together these attacks are also relatively low for the great gain. I mean, I don't know what the budget for Sandworm was. The 2016, the data we have on the 2016 sort of Russian government disinformation campaign was sub $12 million. I mean, that compared to the payoff is strategic level is huge. So again, you're looking at this as low cost, high gain, both in the investment and the lack of later consequence.
Yeah, but the private sector, what you talk about in like war, it's very difficult to, create incentives or disincentives, as you're saying, from the private sector. And there's also, in the like war space, perhaps a need for the private sector to be taking more responsibility, right?
Yes. So if we're talking about, in particular, when you speak about social networks, you have the attackers, you have the defenders, but you also have something different, which is essentially sort of the power behind the throne. You have the platform companies who, again, the changes over the last couple of years have moved from saying, whatever happens on my network, I provide a service, I'm not responsible, to now the big political and corporate debate is how much responsibility does that company, the Twitter, the Facebook, et cetera, bear for what happens on its network? When should it intervene or not? Right. And then who makes it intervene? Is it government forcing it through legislation? We're seeing that in Australia, in Europe, to know it's the customer base saying, Facebook, Twitter, I'm not happy with what's happening on this network. If you don't do something about it, I might leave. And so you're having a debate around kind of corporate and political responsibility that, again, wasn't an issue in 2016, is there. I think the difference with the cybersecurity side that Andy touches on is, no one's yelling at the Ukrainian power company for this in a way that they're yelling at Mark Zuckerberg.
Right. Yeah, there's so much here. I mean, we could honestly sort of chat for 6 or 7 hours about this stuff. I want to move into talking a little bit about what's next, the future of cyberwar, or what's to come, and also the question of what's next for defense. I'm really interested in the part at the end of Sandworm that really talks about resilience. Well, there's a few parts at the end of the book that talk about different concepts of resilience. How do you respond? How do you deal with the situation where all the screens go black? What happens next? And one character, or again, actual person in the book, Dan Geer, is sort of this like sage figure in cybersecurity, and he contributes this perspective about the need for sort of an analog backstop or return to paper and maintaining that type of capability in society. But whereas right now we have a lot of people in the workforce who remember sort of a time before where they remember the old paper systems they used to use or things like that, it seems difficult going forward, with subsequent generations to maintain something like that. So, I'm curious to talk a bit about that and different ways that we can be resilient, and also, just sort of the what's next on the offensive side is the question everyone wants to know
Yeah.
the answer to.
Should
Yeah,
I talk
go.
about what's next on the offensive side first?
No,
Or do you want to talk about resilience?
whichever's more
Yeah.
interesting to you.
Well, Dan Gear lives on this farm, disconnected from, like, pretty much off the grid, and it's very appropriate because he has this idea that we need to maintain a kind of analog baseline to fall back to in the case of these kind of terrible, digital Armageddon events like NotPetya, which he sees as likely to happen again and possibly to happen at a greater scale and in the U.S. So he
has a flip phone that he keeps in his glove compartment, right, of his car?
I think so. Yeah.
Did I make that up?
He has,
So that's his cell phone, guys. It's
he has
in the
like
car.
his like tractor is like 25 years old because he didn't want the new one with too many computerized functions and things. So in Ukraine, for instance, when the first blackout happened, the utilities were able to just send out trucks of guys to manually flip the power back on in all of these distribution stations across entire regions. The U.S. is not as used. We don't have the practice of having to do that very often. Our grid is more automated, and in some ways, as a result, there's more attack surface. It's more vulnerable. It may be harder to take it down because we have better cybersecurity, but it might be easier to keep it down. Another example from Ukraine was the postal service was hit by NotPetya and devastated. Its network was just destroyed. But there were still Ukrainian civil servants who remembered how to work with paper, who had they had like all of the cards from all of the magazine subscriptions and
in
all of the
Ukraine-
paper-based payment systems.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but in Ukraine, the sort of social security equivalent is distributed by the post office, right?
Right, the pension system
Right,
runs
thank
through
you.
the post office as well. So they were ready. There were people there who remembered and could teach the younger employees how to do things with the old-fashioned way, so that when all of their computers were down, they still could carry out their kind of most basic functions, like giving retirees their cash pensions. And do we have that fallback in the U.S. and will we in 20 years? That's Dan Gear's question. As he puts it, we're in this generation where we're on the precipice. We're about to take a step into an era where we have no analog safety net, and he kind of is pleading to maintain that analog fallback, even if it costs more, as a kind of safety net in the case of these digital disasters.
I see Peter writing.
Yeah.
So I just completely disagree with both the likelihood of that approach working and the value of it. And you can think about it in three different ways. One, it has a over time declining ability for you to implement. Simply put, as less and less of the old guard is working at that organization. So instead, so over time you won't have that fallback unless you are paying extra for it, which means it's really hard to implement. Second is life would be worse. So there is a reason why we digitize banking. There's a reason why we digitize the power grid, and it's everything from it's better to you don't have a smart grid, you're not going to be able to do anything about global climate change. And then the third is if you think about it in an adversarial term, and we played with this in the Ghostly book, sure, you can operate, if you are afraid that an attacker might hit you and so you go back to the analog model, you can operate like it's 1975 again.
the attacker's already won if they've actually taken you back to 1975, because they don't necessarily have to act like it's 1975. So if you think about the parallel of Ukraine and Russia, yeah, Russia can hit, and if it sends Ukraine back, it's already won. It's won half the battle. Instead, so I don't think going to the analog model is either viable or the right way to approach it. I think instead is that you plan for resilience in a different way. You plan for failure, and you plan into your system how to either shrug off the attack or recover quickly. So, if you think about the examples of the Internet of Things, we are building networks that are incredibly brittle. We don't have to do that. You don't have to live on a farm to have a 1-week emergency supply in your house and flashlights and the like. The other part of the analog model is not everyone can do it, right? It's a parallel. It's similar to social media, where sometimes people say, well, given all the harms of social media, we should just stop using it. Well, guess what? Not everyone can do that, not just because they're addicted, but they need it for their jobs or where they live. So plan for failure. And then the other element of it is weave in these scenarios. So, you think about the story of ransomware, over half of organizations don't have a plan, don't have backups. So if you've got the ability, yes, they take down your network, but if you can come back online, so what? And so again, we can plan our way around it. It's just, and this is where I hope, kind of the benefit of Andy's book is like helping people to understand, hey, these things are real. You need to be able to visualize it and plan for that. Not everybody go move to a farm.
Yeah, I think in some ways I told Dan's story
Yeah,
because it's a nice analogy, and maybe it shouldn't be taken literally.
But it is a real. But
I think
real people are pushing that as a policy
I think
inside this town.
I think Dan means it literally too. That he wants people to have a true analog fallback. But I think it's a better principle is just let's think about how digital systems fail and make them fail safely. Like if you build the equivalent of an escalator instead of an elevator, so that when it breaks you can just walk up the stairs instead of being trapped in a box, but what that means, and you point to ransomware scenarios, and I could see these as I reported them out inside of companies like Merck and Maersk. Merck had a backup system, but it was a hot backup rather than a cold backup. Like they had a backup facility with all their data, but it was connected to their network, so it got infected and destroyed too. And Maersk had this even more dramatic, crazy story, which is that they had all these domain controllers, which are the kind of backbone of their network across the world, more than 100 of them. And they were all designed to back up to each other, so that if 1 or 12 or 25 went down, there would still be plenty of other copies of the domain controller backups. But they hadn't planned for a scenario where every single one of them is wiped at the same time, which is exactly what happened with NotPetya. So as soon as they started this panicked process of trying to rebuild their network, they realized they didn't have a domain controller backup. They couldn't even start until they did. So they began to frantically call all of the data centers that they had around the world looking for one copy of their domain controller backup, and they finally were overjoyed to find it in Ghana, where there had been a blackout, just a kind of normal, not a hacker-caused blackout, just a normal blackout in this Ghanaian data center. And the result was this one domain controller had been left offline at the moment that NotPetya hit, and all of its data was preserved. So they had to get that data back to their recovery operation out in this town outside of London, and they found that they couldn't establish a secure connection with enough bandwidth, so they tried to fly the Ghanaians to London, but they didn't have the right visas, so they had to fly the Ghanaians to Nigeria and then meet them in Nigeria in the airport and hand off a hard drive with all this backup data, and then fly that back to London and then drive out to Maidenhead and begin this process. So it was a kind of crazy necessary relay race just to begin to rebuild their network. But it's also a lesson about just leave one of your domain controllers offline as a backup, and you could have avoided all of that. And that's the way that the kind of principle of how you recover from a ransomware attack that even hits your entire global network.
What else should we talk about what is to come next? though Sandworm has shown that a group can be prolific in executing these types of attacks and can cross the line many times, luckily, the book came out yesterday, and your predictions didn't all come true yesterday, so that was good. But what else is to come that's on both of your minds?
Well, the next step that I'm thinking about and tracking is, it's strange to say that's the next step because it's already happened, that malware has caused not just disruption, but actual destruction of physical stuff in the world. That first happened with Stuxnet in 2010 when this NSA Israeli collaborative creation, this piece of malware, was able to infect a network in this underground facility in Iran that was being used to develop a nuclear weapon and reach out into these enrichment centrifuges and destroy them. So we've been waiting for that moment to happen again, and not in this kind of targeted and restrained military action that Stuxnet represented, but in the kind of way that Sandworm does attacks, which is indiscriminate, that affects civilians, that doesn't discriminate between military and civilian targets. And just in the last couple of months, a new analysis that couldn't even get into the book, it was too late, of that second blackout attack in Kiev has revealed that may have been intended to be not just a disruptive blackout, but a destructive one. This piece of malware used in that second attack, we knew back in 2016 that it was something really interesting. It was a piece of automated code that directly spoke to the circuit breakers in this transmission station in Kiev. And it was the first piece of malware since Stuxnet that even did that like sent commands directly to circuit breakers to open them. But it turns out, according to this new analysis by this company Dragos and an analyst there named Joe Slowick, who looked at the incident response data and recreated the order of events, that the intention of the attackers, it seems, was that they would first use that tool to turn off all the power, but then there was another step, which is that they would use this little understood component that attacked protective relays in this station. And protective relays are these safety devices that monitor if electrical equipment has an overload of current that might burn lines or hurt someone or damage equipment. And this little component of that attack would put those safety devices to sleep. So the intention, it now seems, was that Sandworm, these attackers, would turn off all the power, and then they would put to sleep the safety devices, so that as the responders in this facility scrambled to turn the power back on, they themselves would cause the surge that could destroy lines or hurt people or just explode a transformer and lead to a blackout, a physical destruction blackout that would have been much more catastrophic than what we actually saw.
And difficult to recover from.
It could have lasted days or
Right.
weeks instead of a matter of hours. So now we can see that actually seemed to have been an attempt by these hackers to cause that thing we've been waiting for, an act of physical destruction aimed at civilian critical infrastructure.
And it only failed because of a small mistake they made, right?
Exactly. This little tiny configuration error in that part of the attack designed to turn off the safety systems made it fail. But we were just lucky.
And they may not make that mistake again now
right.
that they've learned from it.
So I'm just waiting for this moment when one of these attacks succeeds and we see for the first time an actual act of physical destruction that affects civilian lives.
We're going to go to questions in just a minute, but do you have some other final thoughts about looking ahead?
So I'm wrapping up. It's part of why I'm so enthusiastic about Andy's is he's at a different part of the journey. Writing books is, you have the research side, you have the writing side, you have the editing side, and then now you toss it over the wall, and then you hope it's well received, and that's where he's at in the stage, and it should be well received. I'm at like an earlier stage of we're finishing up editing a project that hits your question. It's called Burn-In, and it's two of the elements, and some of it aligns with what you said, that it plays with is one, how we are going to see
more and more attacks on other parts of critical infrastructure. So much of the discourse has been on power grid and the like, and yet as we move to the IoT, every other part of our lives will be woven into this. And then second is that the types of attacks that we will see will not just see information theft, but we will see more and more Stuxnet style kinetic physical damage, but not just being done by politically motivated actors, but by criminal groups, by terror groups, and with that goal in mind. So for example, you think about a smart home, you may conduct a murder using a breach of a smartphone's network. So I may not try and do it on scale, I may go after my neighbor that way. Or you think about ransomware of a city, there's ransomware of holding the files hostage, there's ransomware of locking the people in the city bus until they pay me off to allow the automated bus to stop driving around and let me off the bus or close doors or whatever. So Burnen's playing with that idea of what's next in both the attacker space, the targets they're going after, but the physical consequences of it.
Okay, so on that completely horrifying note, we're going to take some questions. I know it's hard to keep your questions short because this is such a meaty topic. I had trouble with it, but just keep it quick so we can get to as many people as possible and wait for the mic to come around. Yeah.
Hi. So, given your
And
mention.
introduce yourself.
Oh, sorry. Mike Sexton, director of the cyber program at the Middle East Institute. So I was curious, a lot of governments in particular in the Middle East, as they try to modernize and go to become post-petrochemical countries, a large part of that for a lot of them is so-called e-governments, where all sort of government functions will not be something that you go into an office to apply for a passport and all of these sort of daily things. A lot of it will be handled online, so that way things move more swiftly. But obviously that also carries with it the massive risk that you have virtually all of not just the government's own data, but all of the citizens' data all in one place. And that's a massive concentration risk. Given that debate that you guys were having over whether or not there's a value in sort of maintaining the analog mindset versus just having a digital mindset but having backups and having better security, considering I don't think we're ever going to be able to say that these systems are perfectly secure, do you think it's even a good idea to have them at all?
To have a more
E-government?
e-government. I don't know. It really just depends what part of the government we're talking about. I like technology. I think it makes our lives better. But a good example is voting machines. I think we've all come to realize that we don't want an entirely electronic voting machine. We want there to be paper backups. And those paper backups can be something that has nothing to do with the process until you need to do the audits. It's entirely dependent on the part of government we're talking about. But yeah, I think that when you start to digitize your government, then yeah, you are inviting a new kind of vulnerability as well.
But again, it's the point of thinking about it in advance if you're going to do it, right?
Right. Yeah.
Who else? The gentleman in the front.
Richard Coleman, CBP, retired. I know when they were talking about the centrifuges that were destroyed or delayed by the U.S. government's worms or whatever you call it. The presumption, I think, in the public mind is that there is retribution, but it's not stuff that we're supposed to know about, or maybe even fully understand. So the scoreboard might be going on. There might be an actual retaliation event, and we simply just wouldn't know about it.
Well, I think that the idea that the U.S. responded to that the American plan is that if you do a cyber attack on us, we're going to do the same to you, is this kind of mutually assured destruction model that I think totally fails in cyberspace, because for one thing, I don't know, I don't really want to see the U.S. performing attacks on civilian critical infrastructure, but also there is this problem of hackers at least think that they can get away with it because of the difficulty of attributing cyber attacks. It's not easy to see who has turned out the power. It takes months of forensic work in some cases to trace it back to the source with any kind of definitive conclusion. Usually the US intelligence does manage to solve those attribution mysteries, but hackers at least seem to think that they're going to get away with it. They always have a kind of cover story. In some cases, they're throwing in false flags. So the idea that we're going to figure out who it was and hit them with the same kind of cyber attack back, that it's not a good deterrent model because they don't believe that they're going to be found out in the same way that we're going to know when the missiles are flying from the Soviet Union at our Washington, D.C. So if there's a tit for tat, it's not going to deter anybody. It's just, I think it's more likely to escalate these attacks. What I see as the model of deterrence is that we say to them, if we saw what you just did there, here's a whole new round of sanctions that's going to cost you and your cronies billions of dollars. Here are some indictments of everyone involved. We know them by name. This is like Sergei, and this is Vladimir. We know exactly who did this. They're never going to travel outside of Russia again because we'll grab them. Those are the kinds of more peaceful diplomatic measures that I think we at least need to try to.
On a snappier schedule.
Right. Yeah. To actually try to control the behaviors of rogue actors.
Do you have thoughts about this?
Yeah, so I mean, to answer your question, there were definitively activities done, for example, in the weeks before the 2018 election that were not, for example, being done in 2016 that would fit the framework of what you talked about, of aggressive, we would call it defend forward. We got into, for example, the networks of we reportedly, allegedly got into the networks of the entities that had been conducting disinformation warfare attacks in 2016. They happened, but to Andy's point, for it to be deterrence, it's not that you do something, it actually has to change the calculus of the attacker. So we did something. We did sort of the equivalent of like turning off the Wi-Fi and the Internet Research Agency and the like. It did not change the strategic calculus of Putin or Beijing or any other actor that said, oh goodness, NSA Cyber Command got into the networks, made the lives of the attackers a little bit harder. They also took down certain parts of their infrastructure, their online infrastructure. It did not change the overall strategic calculus of we ought not to do that again because it was more painful for us than it was for them. And that's where you need the attribution side, but you also have to have a broader consequence to it. And we've really not been able to master that yet. And it really, I think the debate that needs to happen is first, how do we lift the level of deterrence in the Cold War meaning of deterrence by punishment? You don't hit me because I'm going to hit you back. And raise that cost, be it through hitting things that they care more about. Putin didn't care about the lives of the hackers, whether it's the members of Sandworm's job got a little bit harder than it was in 2017. They do care about billions of dollars hidden in real estate around the world. So you've got that deterrence by punishment or retaliation. And then you have the other element of which you talked about, which is resilience. Building up deterrence by denial. I'm not going to do this because, I don't think it's going to work the same way. Either the attacker's going to shrug it off or they're just going to recover quickly, Muhammad Ali rope-a-dope. So the value of me doing it is not the high payoff that I thought. That's how we can change their calculus.
We can take another question. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Fritz Mulhauser, retired civil rights attorney. Two questions following up on what you were just saying. I don't get a picture of the reward. We're talking about the risk to us, but the reward to the perpetrators. If you could just say who did it and why, and what
Yeah.
was the benefit they reaped from this terrific, horrific response
Yeah. Well,
effect on us.
this-
And second, how hard is it to do this? The risk might be really low if it takes a lot of people with very special skills a long time to mount this sort of attack. On the other hand, if it's easy, then we ought to be really scared.
Well, to spoil the ending of the book in one fact, Sandworm turned out to be the GRU, Russia's military intelligence agency. And for them, I mean, for any intelligence agency, I think as Peter was saying, it's not easy, but it's a lot easier than some sort of SEAL Team 6 operation to like sneak into the capital of Kiev and like get into their electric utility and blow something up. I mean, the digital stuff is cheap compared to actual physical kinetic warfare or sabotage. So it's not that hard. So then I think you're asking, like, what is the reward? Like, why? I think the question is really, what is the motivation of this group? And that is what I kind of spend the third act of this book. You know, it goes back to a kind of detective story after the disaster story of, so who are these perpetrators? Why did they do what they do? And can we, you know, can I actually like figure out what their names are, where they're located, and find them? And you can read the book to see how far I got, which, you know, but as for motivation, I think we can ultimately, I did not actually get any interviews. I did not knock on the door of the GRU Unit 74455 and like ask them to explain why they did these terrible things. But we can see that they were, I think they're experimenting to build capabilities, to show the West what they can do, to try to impress the global audience with their capabilities and make us put that in our calculus of what we'll do to them in their areas of interest like Syria and Ukraine. They're trying, but they're also trying to impress, I think, their superiors. And there seems to be a kind of culture within the GRU of just, I don't know an appetite for risk that is just insane, like a kind of cowboy mentality that you earn your pay for the day just by doing the craziest, most aggressive thing you can think of and then trying to outdo yourself the next day. And not even really thinking about the long-term strategic consequences, but just trying to impress your boss with that tactical win of the day. But I think that maybe the biggest like overarching motivation of Russia as they do these things to Ukraine is it kind of ties in with the disinformation and the hacking and leaking operations. It is another kind of influence operation in a way. It's a kind of terroristic effect where you try to show Ukrainians that they can't have confidence in their own government, that they can't actually experience security in their own country, that Ukraine looks like a failed state. You know, that is, I think, all that this actually accomplishes, because it never wins them some sort of immediate tactical advantage in this war. They're targeting like well beyond the front of the war that they're fighting in eastern Ukraine. So I think it's all about morale, ultimately.
So there's a very clear, in these cases, political motivation. You know, Russia at that time and still today was engaged in a conflict with Ukraine that alternated between being outright hot war, you know, thousands of casualties, to pre or then ceasefire. There's a digital side to it, but there's very clear political goals of it. I think what's interesting, it goes back to Lily's question about the kind of the norm building and changing, is this was a type of attack that had a clear, well, there's two different, but the NotPetya exercise, it's akin to, they carried out an act of arson, politically motivated, but they also ended up setting a forest fire, right? So they had a goal to disrupt Ukraine, cause this lack of consequence, harm to Ukrainian society and politics. But oh, by the way, I don't think they intended to have this impact on Merck or FedEx or whatnot beyond. They used a specific tactic or technology that got out of control. And that actually goes back to this issue, and a little bit connection to your question. maybe the norm is not, hey, nobody do this. Maybe the norm is, if you're going to use these kind of weapons, there are certain rules around the use of that weapon. So there is a clear difference between Stuxnet, which also sabotaged a target, but the weapon, the malware itself, was designed not to harm every other target in the world, even if it got into other computers. By contrast, there was an irresponsibility with NotPetya that just, again, it hits and harms all these other targets. So maybe the norm building is we give up the, hey, we accept everybody's going to engage in cyber warfare of some kind, but even in this space, there are rules to the game.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really important fact that we didn't actually get at, which is that it does seem that all the damage beyond Ukraine from NotPetya was collateral damage. Of course, it was avoidable collateral damage. They could have restrained their worm using techniques like finding the tax ID number of this accounting software they were hijacking to know their victims. But, and in fact, Russia was a massive victim of NotPetya as well, which really, I think, proves that it was largely accidental, that spread beyond Ukraine. But I also want to be clear that if they had responsibly limited this attack to just carpet bombing the entire internet of Ukraine, that's not okay either. And we have to set rules that are more constrained than that even.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. The gentleman here.
Hi, my name is Heath Stockton. I'm with Booz Allen. And I am I'm hearing rumors that the insurance companies that paid out some of the victims are starting to kind of push back and say this was an act of war. And they don't want to pay. And so I guess it gets at a couple things, the rules of war, but also the precedent that's going to be set if they are victorious in not paying them out. So what's government's role going forward?
Well, it's not just a rumor. I mean, Zurich, I think, has said directly to Mondelez, we're not paying your claim on your hundreds of millions of dollars of damage from NotPetya because that was an act of war. Which, when I read that, I was like, thank God somebody else is saying this is pointing to the elephant in the room. This was an act of cyber war, even if they have some hundreds of millions of dollars of incentive to agree with me about that. But I think that I'm not sure. Do you think the government has a role in solving that? Like if you buy an insurance policy and it says we don't cover acts of war, then you should now you got to think about the fact that you could become a victim of cyber war too, and that's not covered. And maybe just get your lawyers to cross that part out.
But the parallel that we're and this will be the debate, and it's already started, is there a parallel to terrorism risk insurance kind of post 9/11? And so the government says, okay, we will guarantee, we give you this kind of protection, airlines or the like. However, this is what you have to implement given that. Right. And so if you do see that kind of immunity given, there needs to be that other side of it is, and oh, by the way, if you want to get this kind of protection, this is what you have to have in place. And that's the part where both sides of that debate are still to play out.
Yeah, well, this has been a really fascinating conversation. I think we should all meet back here for a reunion panel when Burn-In comes out, and we'll check in on where we are. And I thank you both for joining me on the panel, and everyone should go buy Sandworm.
Definitely.
Thank you so much.